Next, we will discuss Simulator's tools for emphasizing certain display objects. The emphasis feature can be used to make specific objects stand out on a one-line diagram. It uses the same engine that's used in the select by criteria, which is shown in an earlier training topic. It combines the select by criteria engine with the use of alpha blending, which basically takes anything that you do not wish to emphasize and de-emphasizes it by kind of merging it into the background. The emphasis feature is found on the Options ribbon tab under the one-line display options. In Simulator, we go first to the One Lines ribbon tab and then the One-Line Display Options button. Then in the Display Options category, there's a section right here for emphasizing specific objects. So if I click on the emphasis filter, then I get the Select by Criteria dialog. And here I can choose which objects I want to emphasize. And then I can also apply a filter to certain objects as well. For example, suppose we wanted to contour all transmission lines on the diagram that have a loading at least 50% of their rating. We could select from the Select by Criteria dialog the transmission lines and then double-click on the filter placeholder to associate a filter. If no filters are defined, we can create one on the fly. So we'll use the condition limit monitoring % used greater than 50%. And then we can give it a name. And then if we wish, we can also apply the same filter to the pie charts and fields associated with those transmission lines. When we select options like fields that have these arrow next to it, then that means we can also choose specific types of objects that are associated with that. So for example, if I only wanted to emphasize megawatt fields, then I could decheck everything else except for the megawatt field over here. Same thing with the pie chart. I might also choose to include background lines in my emphasis as well. Once I've selected everything that I want to emphasize, I can save the Select by Criteria set. Give it a name and then click OK, and then choose the Emphasize option. Then after I click OK, I can see that everything that I chose to emphasize is highlighted here and everything else is faded into the background. So there are two transmission lines in my system that are carrying at least 50% of their rating. The Select by Criteria dialog also allows you to pick objects by layer, zone, or area as well. And you can also filter on voltage level. And there are also options to filter on everything except what meets the criteria above. So you can choose up here what to de-emphasize, and then select this button right here, and it'll in fact emphasize everything else. You can also choose how much to emphasize the things that you selected on the emphasis filter. Moving the selector all the way over to the right will basically make everything else completely disappear. Moving the selector to the other end will basically do nothing, and then everything in between can select degrees of emphasis. If I want to remove the emphasis filter, I can simply clear the Do Emphasis checkbox and then click OK. A similar feature that operates on the Select by Criteria and the advanced filtering is called dynamic formatting. Dynamic formatting allows for conditional display of items on the one-line diagram, and you can change their characteristics based on whether or not the objects meet certain filters. From the One-Line Ribbon tab, select Dynamic Formatting. You have the option to apply dynamic formatting to the case info displays inside the Model Explorer and all views in one-lines, or only to the active one-line. So I'm going to go ahead and select Case Info, all views in one-lines. On this dialog, we can pick an object type of things that we want to dynamically format. We can optionally apply a filter, and then down here we can tell Simulator how to change the appearance of the objects that meet the filter. So following on the previous example, let's say that we want to dynamically format branches that exceed 50% of their rating, as we did with the emphasis filter. After I select the object type in the filter criteria, on the right I can also specify certain types of branch objects that I can dynamically format. With the specified option, I can pick just certain types of objects, such as things on the case information display, the transmission lines themselves, and things that have arrows associated with them then allow even more detailed specifications. So things like pie charts, case information displays, fields, and so forth. So I might select some fields, or I could choose everything associated with transmission lines as well. So I'm going to go back to just the specified items. And then on the lower left, I can specify exactly how to change the formatting of the objects that meet the object type and the filter criteria. So let's say, for example, that I want to make the objects that meet this filter criteria to become thicker, the lines to become thicker, and then also to change color. So I could set the thickness, for example, to a value of 3 and change the color to pink. If desired, I can also make changes or force changes to the font for fields associated with objects that meet the filter. I could place X's on top of the objects or cause them to blink. Or I can force flow arrows to be shown and force the color for the flow arrows to become a specific value, a specific color. Or I could prevent the flow arrows from being shown if they otherwise would be shown. So let's go ahead and click OK and see what these changes do. First, I have to give it a name. We'll just call it Lines Heavily Loaded and click OK. And I can see that it changed the color of the line Also made it a little bit thicker than it was before, and also applied the changes to the fields, as I had selected the transmission line fields to also change formatting, so it put a box around them. I could also change the font color and the font size if I wanted to on that font tab. The slide here shows some of the attributes of the dialog box for dynamic formatting. This icon shown next to some features illustrate those attributes that can apply also to the case information displays that you see inside the Model Explorer. Alternately, if you select the dynamic formatting only for the active one line, some of the features are removed that pertain strictly to case information displays. They're just grayed out, and the case information icon is not shown. This slide shows the example that we just did with lines that were loaded above 50%. One difference is in this particular slide, it's showing the pie chart as being formatted pink as well. If you have different dynamic formatting schemes that could apply to the same object, then you have to select a priority order to determine how objects that meet one or more dynamic formatting filters should actually be formatted if there's a conflict. And that's done on the Set Priority button. So in the dynamic formatting dialog, I can click Set Format Priority, and if I have more than one scheme, then I can set the order accordingly. Also, if I've got more than one dynamic formatting item, I can select one of them and then choose to move it up or move it down in the priority order as shown on the slide. Some characteristics in dynamic formatting, instead of using a filter, can also use a lookup table. So for example, you could check the box right here that says Show Lookup Tables, and then for certain characteristics such as the line color, instead of using the filter up here, you can use a lookup table. By checking this box again, it will pop up another dialog, and for example, in the case of bus voltage, you can select a series of values here on the left and certain colors that correspond to those values. So if the voltage is between 0.9 and 0.95, it would change the line color to red. Between 0.95 and 1.02, it would change it to orange, and so forth. And you can add and delete points as desired in the lookup table. Next, we'll discuss PowerWorld Simulator's GIS support tools. Those tools include the ability to read in Esri shapefiles, which typically come in groups of 3, where you'll have a shapefile that's represented with an SHP file, an associated database file, and an SHX file. These 3 files together describe the shapes that occur in the shapefile and also some of their attributes. Simulator also has some additional tools, such as being able to place a measure line on a one-line diagram and some other related tools for GIS support. In Simulator, in Edit mode, go to the Startup icon and select New One Line. And from here, go to the Draw menu and let's auto-insert some state borders. So we'll click Auto-Insert Borders, and we'll choose all the states in the United States, as well as Hawaii and Alaska. And we'll choose a line color, let's say black, and a thickness of 2. And let's use the Mercator projection. And then click OK. The shapefile insert tool can be found on the Draw menu under Auto Insert, or also under the One Lines ribbon, the GIS tools. So we will choose Insert GIS Data from Shapefile. This menu has several tabs that you can step through in order to format your GIS data. The first tab, the Control tab, allows us to read in our shapefile, while the Modify tab allows us to modify the coordinates. The Identity tab allows us to assign some identifiers for our display auxiliary files and also some links to supplemental data. The Format tab can be used to format the colors and lines, and you can select a single color to apply to all the lines in the shapefile, or you can also use a color map and some attributes. Then finally, the Shape List tab lists everything in the shapefile and its corresponding attributes that are stored with the shapefile series. And finally, when we're ready to transfer things to the one-line diagram, we can click the Transfer Shapes to One Line. So back in Simulator on the Control tab, we'll click in Read in Shapefile. And we will choose the file IN101503, which is a file that has information on interstates and other highways in the US. So I'll click Open, and then proceed to the Modify tab. And what I'd like to do here is convert my shapefile information onto the Mercator projection. This pertains to shapefiles that have data that are in XY values, and the one that I've selected here does have latitude, longitude information in the XY values. So I will choose to convert it to the specified map projection and click Yes on the confirmation dialog. If I wish to shift or scale the data from the original list in the shapefile, then I can specify those characteristics here. Proceeding to the Identity tab, I can indicate a prefix that I want when I'm sending the background information from the shapefile from Simulator out to a display auxiliary file. I can apply certain prefixes or suffixes to the record number, which will make it easier for me to identify the objects within the display auxiliary file. I can also link the display objects to supplemental data. Now, supplemental data are basically attributes that you can apply to objects that do not represent power system objects. And with the supplemental data, we can use that for things like emphasis filters or dynamic formatting or things of that nature. I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead temporarily to my shape list to show you what all happens to be included in this file. This is a list of all the objects that occur in this shapefile, and there are a bunch of polylines and so forth. And then there's some specific fields that are stored in the DBF file associated with the shapefile that identify certain lines. So for example, in this interstate file, we have a bunch of lines that represent things like limited access highways. There's a route number designation, some other designations, and this is just all information that's included within my shapefile. I could use, for example, the route. I can sort on the route number and see that I have a lot of interstates, also some US routes, some state routes as identified here, State Route 2. So all these different data fields are included with the shapes that occur in my shape file. I can use this information that included in the shape file for supplemental data association, for color contouring, for applying different colors to the objects in the shape file, and so forth. So if I go back to my Identity tab, let's say I want to use a link to supplemental data for the route name. That way, maybe I can come back later and emphasize only the interstates based on the data that's included in the route number. So I'll check this box that says link display objects to supplemental data, and supplemental classification, I'll create a new one, and I'll just call it route, and then select it from the drop down box after I create a new one. And then the feature that I want to associate with that then would be the route, and I'll go ahead and select that. And you'll see later after I put the data in that I'll be able to use the emphasis filter, for example, to emphasize only the interstates. Proceeding to the Format tab, I can now assign different colors to the lines as well. Now, since my background lines that I already put in for the state border are black, maybe I want to use a different color for the information that I'm about to read in from my shapefile. And I'll go ahead and select a blue line and click OK. And I don't think there are any polygons in this particular data, but if I had any, I could choose to fill them in blue as well. So once I select that, I can change the thickness if I want, and some other attributes that govern the display. And once I've chosen what I want up here, I click the button that says Set all shape format attributes to the values above, and then click Yes on the confirmation dialog. And I can also specify a screen layer on which to display the objects that I'm about to insert. By default, it suggests a layer that matches the name, but you could give it a different name if you want. Let's click on the Define Layers and insert. We'll create a new layer and we'll call it Interstate. And click OK and close. And from this drop down here, I'll select my new layer called Interstate, and then when I'm ready, I'll click Transfer the Shapes to the one line and close. And I can see that now all my objects from that shapefile were transferred to my one-line diagram. Now let's take a look in the Model Explorer at the supplemental data classification that I created when I read that data in. Go ahead and open the Model Explorer dialog. And the information is located in the group in the Explore tab under Case Information and Auxiliary. And then you can just choose the supplemental data to bring that up. So the supplemental data that I associated with the classification that I created was called route, and that's shown right here. And then the name, it basically just read in all of the different names from my shapefile data. So now I can create an emphasis filter or dynamic formatting according to the value of the name here. So back to my one line, and I'll go into my one line display options, and I'll click on the emphasis filter, and let's say I'll choose my background lines. That's the only thing I have on this particular one line diagram, so that's all that shows up here. And double click on my filter, and I'll filter according to supplemental data, and I'll need to choose a field. I'll choose the name for the condition, and string starts with I. That will basically filter out the interstates, and I'll give it a name. We'll call it Interstate, and then I can go ahead and emphasize, and I've got to give it the select a criteria set a name as well. And then I'll click OK. And then I can see on my diagram the interstates are shown emphasized, and everything else is faded into the background. So some of these minor roots and other things that occurred in my shapefile are faded. Now let's turn the emphasis filter off. I'll go back into the one-line display options and decheck the do emphasis. And I also want to turn off the new interstate layer that I just created. That'll turn that whole shapefile off. And I want to go through a different example here using weather radar, where we can take some of the information from the shapefile and then map it to colors to show the different shapefile objects in different colors depending on what's being shown on the weather radar. So I'll go back to my GIS tools and then choose Insert GIS Data from Shapefile. And this time I want to read in the shapefile that starts with the USRA. And we'll click Open. We'll convert it to the Mercator projection. And I'm not going to do anything here on the Identity tab. But on the Format tab, I'm going to do some color mapping according to some of the attributes in the shapefiles. If I click on the shape list for this file, I can see that it has some different kind of data. The type has things like rain, mix, snow, and then there's also an index value which we're going to associate with the color mapping, and that index happens to correspond to some intensity. Now this is information that is just stored in the shapefile, so you have to know this ahead of time, or you have to know what type of characteristics are stored in your shapefile in order to be able to make use of features like this. These are not things that you can assign from PowerWorld Simulator, but rather they're inherent to the files that you're working with, the shapefiles that you're working with. So I'll go back to the Format tab, and then I'll choose an attribute. In this case I want index, and then I want to assign a color map to it. So I'll click on Modify Color Maps, and then I want to load a color map from a file. And this is one that we have prepared specifically to be compatible with this particular shapefile. So I'll select the one called Radar Colors, and this is a discrete color map that uses the values. It's mapping rather than percentage, mapping values, as we discussed before. So we can take specific values that correspond to values in the index in the shapefile and then map them to this color map, which represents the precipitation intensity that's stored in the shapefile. So then I'll click OK. And then select the color map that I just read in, called Radar Colors, and go ahead and leave these boxes checked. And then the next thing I want to do is change the color based on the attribute /color map. Click Yes on the confirmation dialog. And now when I look at my shape list, I can scroll down here and see that different colors have been assigned to some of the lines in the shapefile according to the index. And again, I can insert into a layer of my choosing. I'll just go ahead and keep the default layer name right here and click Transfer Shapes to the one line and close. And now I can see my file with the precipitation information that was in that shapefile shown on here. And of course I can turn on and turn off other layers, screen layers, to show the interstates, hide the radar, show the radar, and so forth. This slide shows the weather radar shapefile on a one-line diagram with some transmission lines as well. And this combines the shapefile with the emphasis filter. In this case, the weather radar and the other background stuff is de-emphasized and the transmission system is emphasized. This shows the same image with the weather radar emphasized and everything else de-emphasized. Simulator's other GIS tools can also be found on the One Lines ribbon tab and under GIS tools. So a one line that you create in Simulator could be exported as a shapefile. You can also populate the longitude-latitude fields of power system objects such as buses, generators, substations, things that you have on the one-line diagram. You can populate the data fields inside the Model Explorer with the position that you gave that object on the one-line diagram. And there are some other features here as well. Closest facilities to the point, great circle distance, where you can specify two objects that are shown on your one line, and it'll show you the distance in miles between them. You can place a measure line on a one-line diagram, and then look up the distance from one point to the other. Or you can delete all measure lines. And these features are described on this slide. I could use the measure line tool, for example, to estimate the distance between two lines on my diagram, just by clicking on one with the measure line and then double clicking to finish the measure line, and then it'll tell me the length in kilometers and miles. And I can also refer to a measure line that's on the diagram, right click on it, and then bring up the measure length to recall that dialog. That concludes this session on contouring and advanced visualization tools. If you need further assistance, please feel free to look us up on the web, give us a call, send email to our support line, or if you prefer to work with a particular Power World engineer, please feel free to contact that person directly.